Okay, so this is preliminary work, right? So, well, any results may still change. Well, the general disclaimer. And this is joint work with Gabriel, who's a colleague, basically a few rooms here down the corridor. So this paper is about France, so it's sort of perfect to present at a, well, I think originally French seminar. So I hope to get also a bit of your input on whether we have the local context right and that kind of thing. Okay, so if we look at sort of the literature on urban development, right, we see that there is a very strong focus on analyzing the determinants of urban growth, and that has been sort of focal point for many papers, many policies to try to boost growth. However, while some areas grow, some also decline, and that hasn't been sort of studied in detail. Now, let me give a few examples. I think the sort of famous or maybe infamous example is probably the Rust Belt in Detroit, which was sort of booming until the 60s. And then well, the automobile industry was hit very hard. Jobs left to all kinds of countries, were automated. And then, well, Detroit was sort of left behind, almost empty, with a huge housing stock that was deteriorating. Well, Rust Belt and Detroit are an interesting example, but it's definitely not the only example you can give of urban decline or regional decline. Northern England is another example where like there was a big manufacturing industry, also coal mining industry that deteriorated, and also that led to cities being sort of in decline. Another sort of example which is a bit different is like Spain, southern Spain, where there was lots of housing construction in 2000 until 2008. Then the global crisis hit, and then there were lots of empty houses afterwards where no one wanted to live anymore. And the final example, at least that I will give today, is northern France, and that's actually the topic of today. There was a northern France, and particularly the area we focus on, Nord-Pas-de-Calais, was the biggest mining area in France until the 70s, and then the coal industries basically deteriorated quite quickly, and well, lots of people became unemployed, and therefore there were all kinds of long-run effects we want to study. I think it's good to realize, if you think about urban decline, is that it is not the mirror image of urban growth. And this is probably mostly due to the durable building stock. And that's a point that was eloquently made by Glaser and Gyurko, very nice paper, I think, already in 2005. So sort of what happens if an area grows? Well, typically population, income, the building stock, house prices, they typically grow sort of jointly, right? So prices, housing demand increases, and then the building stock responds, maybe not like with an elasticity of 1, but at least there will be new buildings, population increases, and then also probably this attracts richer people. However, in declining areas, this is not necessarily the case. So what you see is sort of that it's easy to, well, you still have these buildings that are sort of already have been built. So the number of buildings are sort of almost a given, at least in the short run. And therefore, you see that the building stock declines much less than the sort of the activity and the income of people. And this means that like house prices go down a lot. Okay, so that is sort of the simple model by Glaser and Gyurko. However, an important point that is sort of neglected by Glaser and Gyurko, and they mentioned it in sort of the last paragraph of their paper, is that like the role of negative spillovers is still overlooked. So what you see is that typically you have this cheap housing that becomes available, let's say in Detroit or in northern France after a shock. And of course, the people that are most sort of susceptible to cheap housing, these are the low income, low skilled people. And they move in, and then they generate a negative spillover, because if there are lots of low skilled, low income people, the high skilled don't want to move in anymore. And this leads to sort of a vicious cycle downwards, right? Where you have more low skilled people moving in, and then lower housing demand, lower building quality, and so on and so forth. And this is what we call at least the sort of vicious cycle of urban decline. Okay, so this is, of course, sort of an anecdotal way of describing how things could be. What we want to do in this paper is that we want to sort of study the interaction of the durability of the building stock and sort of negative local spillovers of a changing local population. And that is to explain sort of the persistence of urban decline. So we focus on the bassin minier du Nord-Pas-de-Calais. So, well, pardon my French, in northern France. And as I said, and probably you also noticed, it was the single most important mining area in France until the 70s. And interestingly, I think, is that pre-1970, the mining companies, they provided also the housing in very close vicinity of the mine. So basically, if there was a mine, you also knew that the people that worked in the mines were living basically next door. And I will give an example later on. And this is sort of a unique setting where the mining basin is very clearly spatially delineated. Okay, so there is a very clear locally defined shock, and that's a bit different from the Rust Belt, for example, where, well, you can argue for a long time about where the Rust Belt ends and where the Rust Belt stops. But here it's very clear, this is the mining basin, this is where sort of the shock happened. And we also provide empirical evidence that this is actually indeed the case. So that's the first step. It's a reduced form approach which we take, where we employ a local spatial DID at the border of the mining basin to see sort of, well, what happens at the border, and also going back in time. So we sort of start in the 60s, then we look at what happens to, let's say, house prices and the share of low-skilled people at the border. And that's the next step, we sort of put these reduced form effects in a quantitative spatial model that includes the durability of the building stock and spillovers in order to sort of gauge the general equilibrium effects and maybe also to evaluate some place-based interventions that could sort of turn around this vicious cycle of urban decline. Okay. So by the way, if there are any questions, you feel free to interrupt, and you can also put it in the chat if you are a bit shy. Okay, so what are the results? So far, at least, well, today we find that house prices at the mining basin border are about 11.2% lower. So that's a substantial difference. It's for example, way bigger than the typical like amenity type of estimates, which lead to like 5%, 6, 7% maybe. But this is a big sort of local price difference at the mining border. And then we try to explain this effect away by, well, spillovers. Just by controlling for a high share of unemployed people, we can explain 60% of this sort of price jump. And then the remaining 40% is explained by a difference in housing quality. Interestingly, there was, like, you can argue about these mining areas were maybe different to begin with, but we don't find any house price differences at the border at the peak of the mining boom in the 70s. So we see that this price difference really grows slowly over time, together with sort of the share of locally unemployed people. And then we can also show indeed that if we control for the share of unemployed population and building age, the price effect is zero throughout. Okay, so these two characteristics, right, building age, so building quality, and sort of spillovers, that is sort of explaining away completely the price effect. And this is, we think, at least, is strong evidence that housing quality and spillovers interact in some way to sustain regional decline.
Hans?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I have a few questions. So it's not completely clear to me why there is so much of a border stuff here, and for several reasons. So, I mean, I understand there are the mines, the jobs related to the mines, but I guess in the region there are also other types of jobs, the feeding, etc. The people working there. And second, I don't get why there should be any discontinuity at the border on the house price and quality. I mean, if you can go live a few hundred meters further away. Or...
So okay, so strictly speaking, it's not a discontinuity, but it's a very local.
Okay.
It's a very local difference, right? So therefore, I don't say we adopt an RDD, but we adopt a local DID.
Okay. Sorry.
And so what is the shock, right? Like, although there is no difference in skills or whatever in the 70s, of course, there were many more mining workers in the 70s than outside. That is sort of well, inevitable.
I see. Okay.
And that is shocked, right? So those people, they are much more likely to become unemployed. So you have locally, you have a higher share of unemployed people in the mining area. And that generates spillovers, which are local. And that generates this sort of local, well, it's not a jump, but it's almost.
Okay. And so just to be sure to understand, you have like municipal level data.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
But fortunately, municipalities in France are, as you know,
they're small.
tiny.
So
Yeah.
cool.
Okay, so this is the a map of the North Pas-de-Calais mining basin from 1901, and this was sort of the map where it is indicated which plots were assigned to which mining firms, right? So, well, you can see that outside this area there was no need to assign anything to any firm because there was no coal. So what we do is we sort of have geolocated this map to indicate sort of the mining area today. So you can also we can also plot that sort of in a sort of map where we also plot the current concentration of people, and you can see that sort of the historic 1901 mining area pretty much overlaps with the sort of the pink area, which is the Northern Variscan Thrust Zone where coal can be found. Two things to note is that like this whole core area is basically underground. So from the surface, you cannot see where the coal is. And therefore, there is also no difference in geography, for example. So you wouldn't be able to tell. Of course, the mining engineers, they knew where to find coal. But otherwise, at the surface, you wouldn't be able to tell where the coal is. A second observation I think that is important to make from this map is that this is not a rural area. Okay, so you can see there is lots of like developments. These are not huge cities or huge metropolitan areas, but these are relatively well developed towns and small cities that are, well, basically sort of growing to each other, right? So this is Lille, of course. This is the really big area, but we really talk about sort of an urbanized area here. Okay. So this is a bit of background. So you see that there was lots of coal production in France until the 60s. Even well in the 60s there was still a lot of coal production, and then it declined. So it's sort of good to realize that this is not a completely discrete shock, right? It is a bit of a sort of a shock that happens over a course of, like, let's say 20-30 years. Chris, you had a question?
Yes, Hans, just if I think about it, usually, you know, once coal mines get abundant, I mean, in some areas you get like issues with, like, you know, the stability of terrain and things like that. So could it be that you have like persistent effects because there's a long run negative fundamental sitting on underground abundant coal mines?
Yeah, so we looked a bit into sort of more anecdotal evidence on soil subsidence. But the coal was really deep, so we don't find much evidence that this was an issue in this area. So I know from other areas there was, like in Wales, for example, it was a big issue, but that was also because the coal is much closer to the surface.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, then you can look at other countries, and they have similar sort of developments, right? Like it was until the 60s also in England, and then it declines afterwards. And in Japan, the peak was a bit later. But it's clear that like after 60s, 70s, the coal production was in strong decline. Okay, so how does sort of this mining towns look like? Well, this is an example we got this is a mining pit where actually the mining workers went to, and the blue stuff is the mining housing that was provided by the mining company. So that was really close, right? And this is just an example. We cannot do it for all mining pits, unfortunately, but at least this is sort of the typical picture. There was a mining pit, and around this there were lots of mining housing. And then typically it was also very close because, well, these mining pits could be everywhere, but often they were very close to existing towns. And this basically became one town with, of course, mining workers and sort of normal workers. Well, what was the type of housing that was provided? This is a typical example. This is called corons, and these are sort of row houses where the miners lived. Well, if you look at it now, you would say, well, this is a bit low quality housing. Back then it was pretty good, right? So it had some basic amenities, at least also some shared amenities, but at least some basic amenities. It was relatively well insulated. So for that time, the housing quality was definitely not bad, especially given sort of the income level of the miners. Okay, so this was the typical houses that were provided to the miners. Okay, so then we can sort of focus a bit more on our area and look at sort of what happens to employment, population density, and housing construction. And then you see a couple of patterns. So we don't have actual mining employment, we do have manufacturing employment. And you can see that it's strongly reduced inside the core area, okay? So so this basically in 2015 we know there were no mines left, right? So this basically like there was lots of mining employment included in the manufacturing sector. Well, the second and then basically outside the core area, right, there's not much happening, right? There's a slight decline in manufacturing, which is probably sort of mimicking the overall decline in manufacturing, but it's not sort of capturing any mining employment. Then you have population, and I think this is sort of really following the standard urban decline story, where you have like it's relatively easy to expand population, but once you have lots of buildings, population doesn't decrease so much. Like because population grew so much since 1876, it looks like it is constant, but it's not, right? So there was a 10%, 15% decline in population since the 60s. So yeah, so it's really the urban decline story. It's easy to expand, and then you have your buildings, your houses, and then people like to live in this cheap housing. And then finally we have construction, and then you can see there was sort of construction increased right until well into the 70s, and then afterwards, after the 1990s, it strongly decreased. Still, you see that there was more new construction inside the core area compared to outside, although the difference is small. And we think that is simply due to the fact that the density was higher, right, at that time. And therefore, well, it's, for example, easier to replace an existing house compared to kind of completely new greenfield development. Okay, so what do we get from this picture? There was a huge shock. Employment went down inside the core area, but population not so much. And then construction inside the core area sort of also plummeted. Okay. Then a bit more about our data. So we draw on contemporary data as well as historic data. So our main unit of analysis is the municipality or commune. And in our sample, like, well, people from France know this, but like I always have to explain this to my fellow Dutch people or people from England. Like the average municipality size hosts only 3,000 residents. Okay, so in the Netherlands, our neighborhoods are bigger than sort of the French municipalities. And that is sort of, in 2015, more than a quarter of all municipalities in the EU were in France, right? So basically, if we talk about municipalities here, basically it means we talk about neighborhoods. Okay, so we have these sort of relatively small neighborhoods with 3,000 people only.
This is true only in big cities, like in the Paris region, you have 1,200 municipalities, but in these small places, well, less than 50, I'm not sure that
There are a couple of hundred.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that you have big municipalities very close to each other with which are integrating in one big urban area.
Yeah, but we have.
I mean, to interpret them as neighborhoods. That's what I mean.
Sorry again. What was
there are two different things. That the spatial scale is small.
Yeah.
Which is one stuff. That you can interpret them as neighborhoods. Then it depends on how close they are and how integrated they are in a common urban area.
Yeah, sure, okay, but like we sort of agnostic about the sort of the relationships between these neighborhoods and municipalities. The point is we have local data. That is the only point.
For sure. Yeah.
Jacques. Okay. Okay, so we mostly draw from the historical censuses of France, which include like the municipal population going back to 1876. And then we have also the municipal composition by job at both the home and the workplace. And we have information on the resident skill level. And also, well, basically 3 days ago, we got also the information on unemployment going back to 1968. Then we have housing censuses, which include the age of the housing stock in 15-year intervals from 1968. We have municipal housing prices going back to 1970s. And then we have some sort of high resolution contemporary data that's more for the appendix, where you have even more detail than only the municipality on house prices and population density. And then we did a bunch of sort of additional data collection on like historical data and time invariant geographical characteristics to do some balancing tests around the mining basin border. Okay, so let's sort of first look at the reduced form results. And I think the methodology is sort of pretty straightforward, at least for many of you, I guess. This is sort of a standard spatial DID model. Or at least a local difference model where you regress sort of the outcome variable on the treatment variable, and you control flexibly for the sort of the distance to the mining basin border. Then we sort of pick the optimal bandwidth H following Calonico. So it has this sort of a flavor of a spatial RDD, but know that, like, let's say we would have like very, very fine-grained data. When you move close to the border, there is no jump, right? Local spillovers are probably then sort of continuous at the border. But because we have these sort of neighborhood level data, and because we know also that neighborhood spillovers are probably mostly occurring within the neighborhoods, we probably observe sort of jumps in our data. So these are a couple of balancing tests to see sort of whether there's anything else that changes at the mining basin border. Well, first of all, you can look at housing density, which was really before the coal boom. And we don't find any difference in housing density for different sort of bandwidths, right? So this is the optimal bandwidth, and then we sort of play around with that. You can also say, well, maybe it's soil quality that could play a role, like maybe sort of related to whatever the construction costs of building, perhaps. We pick a couple of those sort of characteristics describing soil quality. This is one, and we don't find any difference at the border. You can also say, well, maybe there were some historical developments that were like in the mining area, but not outside. For example, the presence of a Roman road, which was an indicator of development in the past. No difference at the border. And finally, like you can say, well, maybe there is some sort of border that is sort of interacting with the mining basin border, but we don't find any difference in distance to the nearest department border. That's 3, or any other border, basically. So in the paper, we do like 20 of more of those balancing tests. We don't find any difference in geography or sort of pre-mining boom characteristics. Okay, so the results outline. First, I will show the house price difference today, and then I will sort of discuss potential determinants. And then we sort of go back in time and see how sort of this price difference has developed over time until now. So this is sort of I would say the baseline outcome. It's a very simple figure. This is distance to the border outside the mining basin. This is inside. And you can see a clear, distinct jump in prices of, well, in this case, 11.2%. So that's a sizable difference in house price per square meters once you move just from outside the mining basin inside the mining basin. Then the question is, okay, this can sort of be driven by all kinds of things, and particularly the most important ones are spillovers and housing quality. So let's look a bit at sort of the potential neighborhood composition or municipality composition. And then also you find a huge jump in the share of unemployed. Okay, so here at the border, you see that the unemployment rate here is much lower than here. Okay. Similarly, or equivalently, you find a strong drop in the share of residents with a university degree at the border. Okay, so the number of low-skilled people is lower nowadays in the mining basin area compared to just outside.
Sorry, Hans.
Yeah.
I have a question. How long is your border? Because
I don't know the exact number, but it's pretty long, right? It's a rather big area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because in your case, we don't compare municipalities just close to the border, because your running variable is just the distance to the border. But why don't you use geographic coordinates or or split the border by segments in order to
Oh, yeah.
compare municipality much closer and much
So
closer.
so we did do that to have like segment fixed effects and more detailed fixed effects. In principle, this is fine, right? I think this is sort of the local variation that is sort of, I would say, valid. But we do some sensitivity checks, including like segment fixed effects or like larger area fixed effects. It seems to sort of lead to the same thing. Results become a bit less precise. So that's the reason why in the end, sort of we focus on the baseline jump at the border. Yeah. Okay. Then the second sort of potential thing that could drive prices is difference in housing characteristics. So, well, you can see that the age of the existing stock is different at the border. So you see that those buildings are older than outside the mining basin. You see that those houses are a bit smaller inside the mining basin. And you see that also another measure of quality would be the share of units with electric heating, which is lower. We also find a small jump in, well, it's maybe not so small, but at least not so clear, a jump in the vacancy rate. So we see that like the housing vacancy rate jumps by about 2 percentage points. And then we can just simply try to kill this sort of 11.2% price effect, right? So this is the baseline regression, well, 11%. And then we simply include this share of unemployed people in the area. And then you already see that you kill about, well, 67% of the price effect in the mining basin. So that is sort of a potentially important determinant of this price gap. Another argument would be, no, it is actually building quality, right? So we can also sort of control for building quality in column 3 instead. And then you kill about 40%, 50% of the price effect. And finally, like we just include them both, and you can easily see that sort of the price effect is reduced to 0. So it really seems that this price gap of 11% is sort of driven both by spillovers, by having a less favorable neighborhood composition inside the mining basin today, as well as sort of lower building quality. Then people have asked in other sort of seminars have asked, like, okay, so what is sort of this spillover effect? What does it really mean? Of course, like our paper is not about completely unpacking the box of why people don't want to live near other unemployed or unskilled people, but like we find sort of strong correlation with other things that people typically don't like. For example, a higher crime rate. So we indeed find in the mining basin area, the crime rates are considerably higher. Another interpretation for why people don't want to live near low-skilled / unemployed people is that like there are negative spillovers on their children. And you see that the success rate at national exams is indeed considerably lower nowadays. Okay, so these are just two sort of anecdotal descriptions of what could be the reason why there are sort of spillovers, why people don't want to live near in areas where there's a high share of unemployed people.
So Jans,
yeah,
I have another question about data source of crimes and infractions. Where is the have you got this data on at municipal level, or is it at
I think
another
so.
level?
Yes, yeah, I think that like Gabriel here is a data expert, so that is he got the data somewhere. I think it's at the municipality level. The exam data may not be. You see that it's a bit like we have the different x-axis, so that's a more aggregate level.
If I can, yeah. So this
Okay,
is at the municipal level for the crimes and infractions. The success rate. So this is school level, and there's a bit less dense. So it's like the college is the brevet success rate. So just the density is a bit. We could get it with with commuting flows like to school at the municipal level, but this is the raw data, and we think it's a bit more kind of there's no assumptions on this. So
unprocessed data, which already looks pretty clear. So yeah. Okay. So this is sort of the now we go back in time, right? So we showed sort of 2015, and now we go back in time to 1970, where basically there was no mining shock yet, and then it slowly starts happening. And you can see that sort of the prices indeed follow sort of the decline in employment in the mining area. And in 2020, the price difference is indeed like about 11%. So it grows slowly over time. Then you can look at the evolution in the sort of the share of unemployed people. And I think, well, at least I find it interesting is that like in 1970, there was no difference. Well, that's okay. But also 1975, there was not yet a difference in unemployed people. And that only sort of started in 1982, or at least between these 2 years. I think it sort of is in line with what we also see in terms of prices, right? We see that like in the early years, not much was happening, and only sort of after 1980, the price difference was really sort of kicking in. And that is, I think, what we also see here. And then after sort of 1990, it's a bit noisy, but we see generally this pattern where it seems to stabilize, where we have a share difference, right? The difference in the share of unemployed at the border of about 10 percentage points. Then similarly, right, we can plot the evolution of the share of low skilled, and that follows a very similar development. So that I think that's interesting, right? That in the 70s there was no difference in the share of low skilled. So these mining workers, they were of course not super high skilled, but like outside the mining area there was just lots of agricultural activities probably, which also don't require lots of skills. So in the early days there was no difference, and only after 1980s we see again this sort of development of an increasing share of low skills. Then you can look at building age, and I think that is even a bit sort of slower, right, compared to the share of unemployed, for example, where in the first 2 years, 1930, there was no difference, 1960, and only in 1990 we see sort of a difference in building age appearing. And this sort of, you know, follows, right, the decline in local housing demands, right? So prices decline, and therefore housing demand is lower, and therefore there's less new construction, and therefore the average building age increases. So, and this is the final plot on the evolution of prices, and you can see, like, if we simply control for the share of unemployed and the sort of interpolated housing age, well, the price gap at the border is completely zero. Okay, so again, sort of it's the same exercise as we did for the data in 2015, but now we do it like for the complete time period, and there is simply no difference in prices. So we can completely explain price differences at the border by differences in neighborhood composition and building age. So that is, I think, again, additional proof that like it is sort of this interaction of durability of buildings and spillovers that can explain why the mining basin is sort of in decline. Okay, so I think this, yeah, Christian?
Yeah, Hans, I mean, I'm still not sure that this reduced form evidence tells you anything about spillovers. I mean, you know, unemployment could be correlated with school quality, it could be correlated, it could be just proxy for all sorts of different things here.
Sure.
So
but there was no difference in the 70s. Okay, so that is important to sort of keep in mind. So
yes, but if you think about the dynamic effect, so I mean, maybe like, you know, as you have more and more like unemployed, there's less and less. I mean, okay, here it's national funding, so the school quality thing is probably like not relevant in the case of France, not like in the US, for example, where most of the funding is local. But you could still say that there are all sorts of, you know, underlying things that change, and that it's not really, you know, when I think about amenities, it's just like, you know, I don't like being around unemployed people, but this is not what you necessarily what you capture here, no?
No, this is okay. I think that is sort of the spillover is, right? Like you don't want to live near unemployed people for whatever reason. It may be that there is lower school quality. It may be that there is, I don't know, higher crime, sort of agnostic. It's just the case that like people don't want to live near high shares of unemployed people, and therefore prices start to decline.
Okay, so you're agnostic. So everything that, you know, is correlated with that is according to your definition and externality.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that is because there was no difference before. Otherwise, it would be a bit tricky, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, to summarize sort of the baseline thing here, right? So house price differences did not exist in the 70s, but they grew over time. When controlling for changes in housing stock and neighborhood composition, the price difference is always zero. And that is sort of the story we have in mind so far, right? So like you have an economic shock that led to higher unemployment in the mining basin. This created negative spillovers for whatever reason, right? People don't want to live near unemployed people, and thus to lower prices and lower housing demand. And then because of this lower housing demand, this attracted an increasing share of unemployed / low-skilled people, and or repelled high-skilled employed ones. And then you are in this sort of vicious cycle of decline going downwards. Okay. Well, then people can come up with alternative mechanisms, but Valentin, maybe you have a question first.
Yeah. Your time series for prices shows 2 jumps. And your controls, they either are linear or they have 1 jump and then plateau. And so I was wondering how you manage. I mean, it seems weird that then you control for everything.
So sorry, your price have 2 jumps. How in this figure or in
no, the one on prices, or is this
the
no,
very
after
first one? This one, you mean?
No, over time. Yes, this one, right? So you see there is, I mean, there is a decline until the 90s, then it's stable over the 90s, then there is another jump downwards in the beginning of the 2000s, and then stable again, right?
Yeah, well, like given the confidence bands, I think if we would draw a linear line from here to here, I think we cannot reject the null hypothesis that this is a linear trend. So I wouldn't make out too much of this here being stable. Like look at the confidence bands, right? That's
Yeah, no, maybe I don't know, but still for the then if you go to the slide where you show with the controls, then
well, I think basically here it's also stable more or less, no?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas, I mean, that's what I'm surprised with, is that there you have 2 jumps in the estimators. So, okay, maybe the confidence intervals overlap, but there you have 2 jumps in the estimators. So I would expect in the controls to have at least one jump, one first jump and 1 second jump in one or the other of the controls, even if in the end 0 is within the confidence interval of your DID. And I don't see that. I see that your DID estimators with all controls, they are all. I mean, the estimator is very close to 0 everywhere. Yeah, here.
Yeah, but that's because building 8 is also probably somewhat non-linear in the sense that, like, maybe, for example, the effect really kicks in here could be that now building 8 becomes really like old, and that is, for example, here we see a bit of a jump.
Yeah, okay.
Right,
yeah,
so
here you have another jump.
Okay. Yeah, it is not entirely sort of obvious how sort of spillovers in building 18. It doesn't have to be linear. That's my point. Yeah, but at the same time, I wouldn't. I'm sort of quite happy with this, right? That over time we can really kill the effect, and even if it would be a bit above or below, like given the confidence bands, I wouldn't be too much concerned. Okay. Couple of alternative mechanisms. So you can say, well, maybe this whole price difference is just driven completely by the sort of specific housing that is provided by mining companies. So that means that if you would go to another area, you would find very different effects. So what we do is like these corons, right? There were almost always row houses. So if we estimate the effect only for apartments, which were sort of part of the original mining, well, the original towns, we find basically the same price jump. Okay, so this sort of thing is not driven by, it doesn't seem to be driven by the sort of specific housing provided by mining companies, but generally sort of affected the town in the completeness. Then you can argue, well, maybe like this unemployment shock sort of affected the incomes of former miners. They couldn't move, basically. They were too poor to move around. And then, well, basically, it's a complete sort of spillover effect is completely driven by the original miners in the area. Well, we don't find any evidence for this. If we look at the sort of average difference in the length of residency nowadays in the municipality, it's just actually a bit lower than just outside of it. So the sort of the mobility, right, is a bit higher inside the mining basin compared to outside. So this suggests that it's not like at least the effects we measure today are not due to the original miners. They all have been gone, right? It's already 50 years ago. It's mostly like the new people that moved in that are low skilled or and or unemployed. And then the final sort of comments people could have is that like there were initial difference in geography or employment opportunities that sort of had sort of long run effects. But we call the balancing test here. There was no price difference in the 70s, no difference in skills. And in 1919, there was no difference in housing density either. Also, we looked at sort of the industry composition in the 70s. We don't find any difference in the share of service workers or the share of high value added firm creations. So it also seems that other than mining, there was not much difference in sort of the mining basin versus just outside. Okay, so I will not go sort of into details of the model because it's all very preliminary. So we still work on this. So if you have any sort of ideas on sort of what we should do or what we shouldn't, then let me know. But I will just sort of sketch a bit the idea we have to sort of put these main effects into a quantitative spatial model. So sort of the basics are very similar to any other QSM basically people have seen. There are two types of skills, low skilled and high skilled. We have Cobb-Douglas utility, then we have commuting, and then we have an idiosyncratic phase shock, which is very familiar to most of you. And then we have amenity levels in a location which is endogenous. So that's important. And this amenity level depends on the building age in a certain area and the share of low skilled. Okay. Then we have production, and that's even sort of simpler than the workers. That is two types of skills, two types of sort of production that employs two types of skills, low skilled and high skilled, simply Cobb-Douglas. And we have endogenous productivities that are dependent on agglomeration economies. So we can sort of relax this to CS or whatever. It will not change much because it's not sort of where the action is. What is more important is the sort of the floor space provision, okay? Because that is sort of the dynamic part. It's not that workers are forward-looking, at least not in the terms of 50 years. I would find it very hard to believe that workers in the 60s would already know that there was a huge mining shock coming and therefore, did change their behavior substantially. That's not what we see, right? But of course, floor space provision may be due to sort of dynamic decisions. So what do we sort of have in mind now is that there are developers that decide on whether or not to develop a certain plot, and they want to maximize their objective function, where sort of this objective function is a function of housing price in T and the building cost in VJT. Okay, so there is some function here of prices and building costs, and then the building costs in a certain area may depend on whether there already exists a property or whether there are lots of property already existing, because then it's cheaper. It's basically maintaining, or whether basically you completely have to develop new buildings, right? That will be more costly typically. At the same time, you can argue, well, if there are lots of buildings that are very old, right? Like it could be that the age of the property also play a role, and that would lead to higher building costs, right? So we can play around sort of with having already lots of buildings in the area, and also the age of this building stock that will affect sort of the sort of the objective function of developers to provide a house on a certain plot. Then we have a discount factor, and we can write sort of the dynamic the rewards in a certain location as the current sort of flow utility, flow profits, or whatever you will call it, sales. And then it also depends on the future, or like a developer can also decide to sort of develop something outside the area. Let's say he or she decides to develop something in Paris. And then we can write the probability, if we assume that these shocks that happen to each developer and each plot in each municipality in each year, if they follow a type 1 extreme value type distribution, then the fraction of plots being developed in a certain area in a certain time can be written as a simple sort of logit probability. Okay, then that is sort of and then you can sort of show equilibrium, right? This, for example, the total number of plots developed should equal, of course, demand for houses in each area and each year, right? So that is sort of we can define the equilibrium conditions that are necessary to hold in this model. And then we can estimate the model, and that is also very preliminary. So here are a bunch of parameters. I just want to show you a few things, okay? So first, we have commuting data, and that is necessary sort of to ensure that people that work, that live in the mining area, they can also work outside the mining area, right? So it is really sort of the only difference at the border is these local spillovers and the housing quality. In principle, the labor market extends across the border of the mining area. And that is, well, what we show basically here. We find this sort of travel time elasticities that are slightly different between low and high skilled. If you sort of address the endogenative travel times, they are about sort of minus 0.1, which is very close to the Berlin wallpaper, or it's minus 0.08 for the high skilled. So the high skilled commute a bit further than the low skilled, which we also see in many other countries. Then another thing I think that is interesting is sort of the effect on amenities, right, which is very important for sort of the spillover story. So we can sort of recover these amenities from the model. And then we have, for each location, we have a certain amenity level in a certain year, okay? And then we regress that sort of implied amenity level on the average building age and the share of unskilled. Well, what do we see? Well, we see that the high skilled, they dislike old buildings, okay? So if the average buildings become older, then the high skilled don't want to live there. Also, and that is less surprising perhaps, is that the high skilled don't like to be near unskilled people. Okay, so they have a strong distaste to live in areas with high concentration of unskilled people. Well, that is sort of follows a large sort of literature that also has established this already. Then we can do the same for low skilled people. And then I think that is a bit interesting, and that sort of may explain also this sort of sorting effect, is that like the building age effect is much less strong for the low skilled. So the high skilled care a lot about housing quality and living in a new building. The low skilled, they say, well, okay, we don't care so much, right? So this coefficient is pretty close to 0. The low skilled also don't like necessarily, it seems that they don't like to live near high shares of unskilled population, but the effect is considerably less strong than for the high skilled, right? So the effect is about 50% of the effect for the high skilled. So therefore, it will mean that like in areas where there are high concentration of unskilled people, it is more likely that the low skilled will end up there than the high skilled. Okay. Well, you can estimate more regressions, and that is a bit. I don't show you much more because it is all sort of we are working on this, so it probably will change in the course of the coming weeks. I think why we do this, right? Why would we sort of develop this model? Well, I think we can then answer a couple of, I would say, interesting questions, right? So the first one is probably, and we don't know much about this, when is the sort of vicious cycle of decline expected to stop, right? Is it sort of, when do we reach a long run equilibrium? Is it in 10 years, maybe we are already in a long run equilibrium, or will it take another, I don't know, 100 years? That's the first important question we don't know much about. The second question is then like, okay, so is this sort of urban decline, is it mainly like a building age effect, or is it mainly a spillover effect? So if we sort of shut down one of those two channels, what will happen sort of to the long run equilibrium? And finally, and that is of course more sort of contentious, is that like what sort of public policy packages would be promising in attenuating urban decline? You can even argue, well, like maybe sort of aggregate welfare is maximized if you don't do anything, right? Because it's just a result of sorting of people. But still, we could look, for example, at the welfare chains of the low-skilled people for different types of public policy packages. For example, one could consider, tearing down old buildings. That it has now been done in Detroit, where they tear down old houses. You can think of a subsidy to the high-skilled to live in the mining area. And maybe you have other ideas. What could be interesting policies, sort of to see if we can sort of avoid sort of the vicious cycle of decline from happening. So I just want to show you the preliminary results of the first step, and it is sort of this thing here. So the blue dots here are sort of the equilibrium outcomes if we sort of following from the model, right? So, and you see that there is indeed like an effect downwards, right? It's sort of the housing price gap we plot as the main outcome here between the mining and the outside the mining area is indeed predicted to be zero in the 70s. And then it starts to increase. And it basically converges only like after, well, in this case, 34 periods, which is about 15 years. So that is about 400 years after 2015. Okay. Interestingly, and I think this is why I like these results so far, is that it sort of closely mimics the decline in the housing price gap, which is observed in the data, right? So the sort of development here over time is pretty closely following the actual price gap we observe in the data. Okay, so of course this is just one moment we sort of match, but it seems that it's an important moment we can match even with a very simple dynamic framework. So the takeaway from this is it takes a long time before sort of the overall effects of urban decline will will be over. And this is, I think, in line with a couple of existing papers on like the East Side pollution paper by Stefan Hebli, for example, which also shows that like you have these long run sort of amenity effects that have a very long run effect still nowadays, right? Or the Portage paper by Jeffrey Lin, right, where like some sort of old amenity effect or productivity effect still has an effect like 300 years later, right? So I think this is not super surprising, but the nice thing is we can actually show that this takes a long time before the effects of urban decline completely materialize. Okay, so I think I'm almost there. So the I don't have to tell you after particularly of this presentation that urban decline is surprisingly persistent. So you see that like a shock that happened like a decade ago or a few decades, maybe a century ago, still has important effects today. And we hypothesized in this paper that this is due to the complementarity of an increasing inflow of unemployed and low-skilled workers and an aging building stock. And this sort of generates negative spillovers, particularly the increasing share of unemployed people generate negative spillovers that sort of lock in this area in attracting even more low-skilled people and therefore also lower housing quality. And using reduced form spatial DID effects, we show that an adverse neighborhood composition explains about 60% of the house price effect, while an aging building stock can explain about the rest. So sort of the overall conclusion, at least for now, is when aiming to understand the urban decline, one should not ignore the built environment nor sort of the lock-in effect created by an unemployed population. Thank you very much.
Hans, this is Jacques speaking. Do you hear me?
I can hear you, definitely.
Okay. I'm not too familiar where this region is located in France relative to Belgium, but I think it's relatively close to Hainaut. And Hainaut was also a coal mine region, which has been very prosperous in the 19th century. Nowadays is by far the poorest province, which is equivalent to a department, the poorest provinces of Belgium.
Yeah.
Right. Same thing, right? Housing, the quality of housing is very low. And in the old days, I mean, there was a relatively large number of cross-border workers, French workers going to Belgium and vice versa. Now, as far as I know, but we have to check that, the decline of the coal industry in Belgium started earlier because it was already close to death in the 60s.
Okay.
So maybe there would be, some spillover effect in the sense that some workers who would work in Belgium would stop working in Belgium because they could not find a job, but would not necessarily change their location because they would say, okay, here in our French region, maybe that our job will survive or something like that.
Yeah.
So in your paper, you don't mention this relationship with Belgium, and it could well be something significant. And my last point is that today, this region of France, if you take the Flemish region now, just north of Hainaut, it's a very prosperous region.
Yeah.
So now, as far as I know, there are French workers who cross the border to work in Flanders, in this part of Flanders.
Yeah.
So maybe that those people want to stay and live in France for the school system or blah, 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 but work in Belgium.
Definitely. So, okay, so let me reply. Like, okay, so I think it's a good point that there could be cross-border commutes. I showed the area here, right? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Charleroi is somewhere here, I think. So it is the mining area in Belgium really sort of extends here. What we sort of simply could do is to exclude redo some of the analysis, but exclude the area close to the border to see if that completely changes the results. That is one. And the second thing is that we have information on commuting flows. So we can see, I'm not sure, Gabriel knows better probably, whether we also have cross-border commutes, but at least we know sort of how people commute, at least within this area, but maybe also sort of outside this area. So, well, Gabriel probably knows better.
No, yeah, so this is something we could observe. So I don't know back in time that we have to check, but for today, we could test for whether flows are typically different around the border, mining border. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But an important point to make here is that, like, we expect indeed that this is basically one big labor market. The only difference here is not the access to jobs at the border, but it's actually having a high share of unemployed people and having a low building quality. So that is sort of what changes here. But the jobs you can access from here, right, on both sides to Lille is the same, or to Belgium or whatever. Okay. Other questions?
Yes, I have a second question, Hans. I sent you this paper on local ties, right? I'm not familiar with the social history of this part of France, but in Hainaut, these social ties were very strong, very, very strong, and they act as a brake to the mobility of people. Until the 70s, right, for workers, especially for coal miners or steel workers, there were different type of social and political association, which play a bit the role of an extended family. I know it sounds a bit excessive, but what they were in Belgium in the old days. So in a way, this discouraged some people to move and to find a job in another area, because their social ties were really very, very strong. I grew up in a region like that, and I'm a bit familiar about, the way this has an impact on people. Now, where there's something similar in France as it used to be in Belgium, this I don't know.
I think you were right that probably in the first, let's say 10, 20, 30 years, people really wanted to stay because of this, right? There are all kinds of organizations also linked to the mining companies, typically, at least in the Netherlands. I guess it would have been similar in France. So people wanted to stay, but at least nowadays, right, we don't see this anymore. So the sort of social capital seems to have gone. And that is backed up by what we see sort of on the average duration of residential, the average residential duration, which is now shorter in the mining area compared to outside. So actually people are moving around faster inside the mining area compared to outside. And this suggests that at least nowadays, the things we observe nowadays cannot be explained by social ties, at least not between just inside and just outside.
But when you say that people move, they move more quickly, do you control for the age of those people? Are there the young people who live very earlier, or the middle age or old people?
It would be a good one. Gabriel, do you know whether we have information on this?
So we do have, we didn't do it. So this is unconditional on age, but we do have the information. So it's something we could absolutely look at. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be interesting to see whether the old people stay put. These would be the original miners, while the young people, well, we don't care so much about them. Yeah.
Just a question, please. Many thanks for the presentation. Do you know if there are in this region specific public policy for the improvement of housing, like in other places in France?
As far as I know, not really. but Gabriel, correct me if I'm wrong. Of course, there were like unemployment benefits and these kind of things to sort of let people not sort of starve to death, right? That is clear. So people could sort of stay if they wanted. But as well, some former mining houses were sold to well, developers or landlords, and some of them were transformed into public housing. But of course, there was a bit of public investments there, but I think there was, at least as far as I know, there were no huge sort of upgrading programs. But Gabriel, maybe you can add.
Yeah, so sorry, I don't want to step on that, but so I think that there's one thing that still a bit on top. So everything that Andre was saying is perfectly true. The one thing on top is that the UNESCO, so the World Heritage, recognize some of these sites in the area. So we have a set of robustness where we include, exclude, and play a bit with this. But in a sense, what we're saying is that you know, we have to take this with caution, but it seems to be the worst thing that you could have done to have put this area as a World Heritage site, because it didn't attract much tourism, because I mean, yeah, this is maybe not but in you know, what it did instead is that around these sites that are protected, if I remember well, it's 250 meters around this site. You have extremely strict rules about how you're allowed to update the buildings that are around, and which just makes it extremely expensive. So in a sense, it made, if anything, the updating and the demolition and all the things that you would like to happen even more difficult, with very little benefits. So I think this is on top. As I said, we have the precise location of all of these sites. We can exclude templates. This is not driving the result, and this was in the 2000s, so it's quite late in the period. But except of that, we're not aware of any specific thing that happened on housing. There was a policy on firms more recently. So I think in 2017 they have, if I remember, if I have to check again, but there's some tax credits on firms that were, the idea was to, which is also something that because it doesn't seem to be that employment per se, the location of jobs doesn't seem to be the issue, but it's like the high skilled workers, they might work in the mining basin in some of the big towns, but live outside. So it seems that it's really on the residential aspect that is central, that we need to tackle if we want to do something about this. That's why we all the counterfactual that we're thinking about are on residential locations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your input, Lionel. Maybe you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you. We have time for one or two other questions, if there is.
Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, so I was thinking a little bit more. I mean, you would need more microdata probably to get into the dynamics of the thing. But so if you think about housing price decline, one thing that usually happens is that your mobility is linked to your housing price. I mean, you have to sell and then to buy something new, and then if you have a housing price shock, you get stuck basically in the region. So this does not seem to be the case in your setting, because housing prices basically they start to decline only later.
Yeah.
I mean, so can you observe like that, in the first stage, like the more skilled or the more mobile actually leave, and therefore, is this why housing prices then drop at some point, and that attracts then the lower skilled people? So it's more like about the dynamics of the thing that could be interesting. So I can think about this in 3 stages. It could be like, I don't think it's like basically sorting in the sense that it's like low skilled moving in and displacing high skilled. I think it's mostly like in the first stage, like those who can, they leave, and those who can't get stuck. Then afterwards, that changes composition. Then afterwards, that triggers sorting, maybe because of these externalities or because of the lower priced housing stock. And then in the end, what would be cool to see is, whether then you have the pattern of persistence in the sense that, you know, the younger generation born there is stuck there, has worse outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So this whole dynamic could be interesting to look at, but I understand that you need different types of data to actually do that.
Well, like I think we see the bid back, but it's a bit sort of eyeballing. I think it sort of like we see that the price gap really sort of started after 1980s.
Yeah,
that's the first observation you can make, and then you also see that the unemployment rate really starts somewhere happening between 1970 and 80. So I think the story you have is sort of in line with this, right? And that's also what we thought. Like you have first you get this unemployment shock, then you have a higher share of unemployed. Well, maybe the employed leave. We don't know what happened. At least the people that move in then, right? That sort of replace the people that left are probably people that don't care so much about having higher shares of unemployed people. And these are probably also unemployed or they are low skilled people. And then the ball starts rolling. So I think what we maybe could do a bit better is to show indeed that first there is a shock of unemployed people, and then you get the house price shock. But still, right, like I think overall the fact that if you control for this, there is no house price jump, I think is already sort of evidence in itself. Yeah.
And then my second question is, so I'm not sure whether you have enough variation within that mining area, but are there some parts of that area that have been doing better or that have been, you know, absorbing that shock better in the long run or not? Because I think that the $1 million question is, you know, why do some declining areas reinvent themselves or sort of get back, whereas others get perpetually stuck in something?
Yeah.
So I understand that this is mostly like big regional differences or cross-country differences that people have been looking at. But I mean, I was wondering whether, you know, some areas, let's say more urban parts or less or parts closer to the border, or is there anything like, are there some parts of that area that have been doing better, or is this just through the border like very bad everywhere?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the urban versus less urban is probably an interesting dimension of heterogeneity we can look at. I think what also matters is sort of when a positive shock, sort of the timing of a positive shock, and also of a sort of policy package. If it happens relatively soon after the shock, then you see that these areas that are hit, they are doing typically better again. So there is this sort of famous, I heard it from someone, story about Nokia in Sweden, right? Nokia went bankrupt or at least downsized substantially in this small Finnish town. Sort of the next day, literally, the municipality called all the workers of Nokia. So what should we do to keep you, right? And of course, this town is now doing fine. So if you sort of do it immediately after the shock, then the effects will be much smaller. And I think that is probably something we can also show with our model. If you would sort of probably implement some policy packets or have a positive shock, like let's say in early 1980s, then probably like we are not in sort of in the same amount of decline as we see today. So that would be another sort of way to go a bit to the $1 million question.
But you have two shocks actually in your time series. You have the mining shock and you have the China shock, and you see those very clearly. I mean, I think.
Yeah, but like I think the China shock shouldn't affect too much. Because like this is not.
Well, but you're measuring manufacturing, you said.
Well, like basically, like there's lots of manufacturing employment here, and I think this is pretty continuous. So you can argue, well, then here this should be a sort of a, you know, an extra.
I was more thinking about the house price series where you see really like the two shocks. I have the impression.
Yeah. Well, in principle, the only thing we need, right, for this story sort of to hold, and we use the mining story because it's I think easy to explain, is a sort of discrete shock in local unemployment rates, and then the story unfolds. So whether there is another shock in 2000, perhaps we don't know, but at least it seems to be mostly the mining shock in the beginning, right? That's the real big push. Okay.
And if I may add one thing on this, I think on the world, you know, this World Heritage UNESCO recognition, it's quite interesting. So we're not pushing too much on this because we're not sure that it fits, but it answers partly your question that those that have had these stricter rules about renewing the building stock are doing significantly worse today. So if you see, you know, if you compare the price in areas that have had one site recognized versus no site being recognized, you see that those that have had the recognition are doing significantly worse today. So kind of this is a bit of a kind of reverting the argument, but the idea being that if it's harder to let the housing stock evolve, it's going to be even the consequences are going to be bad. So, you know, kind of vice versa, the policy idea would be, you know, get, you know, any type of policy that can allow the housing stock to evolve, you know, as, you know, following the economic activity in a sense would help. Yeah.
So
Okay.
be a very last suggestion, Hans, maybe for a different paper, right? But it could be interesting to compare what you observe in France and what you observe in Belgium, because there are real difference in institutions, right? The institution, France is a much more centralized country where religion doesn't play the same role. Trade union were not and are not as powerful as they were in Belgium. Belgium really provide, especially in those regions, really something which is fairly specific. And it would be interesting to see if the existence of those institutions, the difference between institutions, has played a role or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what it makes a bit hard to study this is, of course, data, because you would need data for
I don't know,
countries, and that is typically the problem. I'm still thinking whether we can do something along those lines in our sort of counterfactuals, right? You could play around with different types of subsidies to former mining workers, for example, inside the mining basin in the counterfactual, or like provision of public housing or something like that. That is something we could change in the counterfactuals, not to actually pinpoint this entirely, because we don't know exactly what happened in Belgium, but at least we could sort of check this a bit. Yeah.
Should not be too difficult to find something.
Yeah.
Maybe I can help you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lance. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Hans, for this presentation, and thank you, Gabriel, also, and thank you all for your participation. And we will share you the program for the next semester soon. And I wish you a nice day.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments.